Let's discuss about REST and HTTP. Let's start with REST. I am in the Wikipedia page for REST. REST stands for Representational State Transfer, and it is a software architecture for interactive applications that typically use multiple web services. And the term REST is intended to evoke an image of how a well-designed web application behaves. It is a network of web resources where the user progresses through the application by selecting resource identifiers such as example.com/articles/21 and resource operations such as get or post. The key points to note here are: we can think of a web application being a network of web resources, and the user interacts with the application by selecting resource identifiers of the web resources. And an example of a resource identifier is example.com/article/21, basically a URL. So the user selects web resources using resource identifiers which look like this and does resource operations such as get or post. So web resources have resource identifiers, and the user interacts with the application by performing resource operations such as get or post. So the terms that REST uses are resource. It asks us to think of a web application as being a bunch of resources, and those resources will have identifiers which are called URIs, and URLs are an example of URIs. If we go to the Wikipedia page for URIs, it says that URI stands for Uniform Resource Identifier, and it is a sequence of characters that identifies a resource used by web technologies. And some URIs are used for locating and retrieving resources on a network, and such URIs are called Uniform Resource Locators, or in short, URLs. So URLs are an example of URIs. And the third term that we have seen with respect to REST is resource operations. And examples of resource operations are get, post, etc. Let us look at some examples of resource identifiers. If books is a resource, then this URL will give us all books. And this URL, since it has /1 after books, it will give us the book with ID 1. And this URL, since it has /2 after books, it will give us a book with ID 2. So you can think of this being the resource identifier, and if that resource is accessible via a RESTful API, that means that other URLs like this are also possible. If we have books as a resource, what are the possible resource operations? From the application point of view or from the user's point of view, we can get all books. We can get a book with a specific ID, for example with ID 1. We can create a new book record. We can update a book with a specific ID, for example with ID 1. We can delete a book with a specific ID, for example with ID 1. So in general, if we have a resource, it is very likely that we would want to do CRUD operations with that resource. For example, these operations. And such CRUD operations can be mapped using this mapping over here. So this table provides a mapping between application actions and HTTP verbs. In order to create new records, we'll have to use the post HTTP method. And in order to read or retrieve records, we'll have to use the get HTTP method. And in order to update records, we'll have to use either put or patch HTTP methods. And in order to delete a record, we'll have to use the delete HTTP method. We can summarize our discussion up to this point by using this table over here. This column lists the resource operations, and this column lists the resource identifiers, in our case URLs. So to read or retrieve all books, we need to use the get HTTP method against the URL /books. And to read or retrieve a book with ID 1, we have to use the get HTTP method against the URL /books/1. And to create a new book record, we'll have to use the post HTTP method against the URL /books. And to update a book record, say with ID 1, we'll have to use either the put or patch methods against the URL /books/1. And finally, to delete a book, say with ID 1, we'll have to use the delete HTTP method against the URL /books/1. Please note that REST is a way of doing things, and currently it's a de facto standard for building APIs. So if someone says that they have exposed a RESTful API for a resource, say books, then we can guess that these operations will be possible using these HTTP methods and these URLs over here. we would not have to look at the API's documentation, at least for CRUD operations. The documentation for REST at developer.mozilla.org says that HTTP APIs in general are sometimes colloquially referred to as RESTful APIs or RESTful services or REST services, and that beginners can assume a REST API means an HTTP service that can be called using standard web libraries and tools. Today, in general, HTTP APIs are being referred to as RESTful APIs, and that in general discussions, a REST API means an HTTP service. So a REST API will typically provide these operations using these URLs and these HTTP methods, and most likely that API will include HTTP APIs as well. Next, let us discuss how to construct individual HTTP requests for each of these operations. And before constructing such HTTP requests, let us take a step back and discuss a little about HTTP in general.